So my name's Jesse O'Brien. I mix broadcast audio for Red Rocks Church. How I got started was back in 2013. Tyler Roberts, who's kind of the head worship leader here. I worked at, I'm sorry, I'm gonna change the key. So before that, I've worked at a studio since I was 19. So I work in a recording studio here in Colorado. And Tyler Roberts came to that studio and was like, hey, we need somebody to mix our services for online every week. He multi-tracked the whole thing during the service. He'd bring it to the studio, and then I'd mix it up that week and give it back to him, and they'd put it online the following week. They really hated that it was a week behind on their online campus. So they're like, what do we have to do to make that happen? I was like, well, if you want to maintain quality, you got to build a room. You got to build a broadcast studio. So someone, can sit in there and mix just for online. They're not worried about front of house downstairs. They're not worried about making it sound good in the room. So they built the room. And at that point, when we first installed it, we put a CL5 in, which is what we have at all our front of house at all our locations. So we had a whole CL5 in here with SoundGrid, and that's where I did all the mixing until COVID hit. And then I transitioned over to Pro Tools. Now Pro Tools, it made sense, but I'm the one that wanted to stay away from Pro Tools at the beginning. I wanted to use an actual digital console purely because of reliability. We all know DAWs are notoriously unstable, especially when it comes to broadcast and live audio. So what justified the switch, and we really kind of thought it out, is the stability of a DAW kind of really depends on the user and how they're using it. Now, with that being said, how we use Pro Tools here is we use it just like a digital console. So digital consoles don't really record anything, right? They pass audio through processing, through EQs, compressors, through faders. That's all they're doing. You're using a separate device to record. So that's exactly what we're doing here. In this Pro Tools rig, we've basically just set up aux tracks. We're not recording anything to this Pro Tools rig. We're literally opening up a track, putting plugins on it, letting the audio pass through. It's allowing me to set up tracks, bust things together, add plugins, create a virtual mixer, basically. So that immediately increases the stability of Pro Tools quite a bit. Now, why did I go to Pro Tools in the first place? Well, two big reasons. Plugin diversity. So I can use any and every plugin that I could dream of. It's Wave SoundGrid is cool, but I can only use Wave's plugins, and they make some good plugins, but they don't make all the good plugins. So that's a big one. And then routing. DAWs are just set up better for routing for mixing. So when you start talking about like additive drum compression and side chain type stuff, that sort of thing. Now digital consoles can do that, but DAWs are just designed around that, so they do quite a bit better job, and they handle latency of all this bussing, and so everything stays in phase, phase accurate through all the bussing, all the routing that you might throw at it. So those are the two big reasons why I switched. The programs we're using to multi-track are very accessible. $60 for Reaper, and boom, you got 64 channels of audio being recorded. And that's it, all through Dante. Network audio is an amazing, it's amazingly functional. You can do stuff that you could do with analog, but my gosh, it'd be nutty expensive and a mess. But basically with network audio, it's just a network. So you plug whatever audio device into that Dante network. You hook all the devices up to network switches, and once they're on the network, then I can route anything to anything. So I can say, all right, I have my stage boxes where the actual mics are being plugged in on stage. I want channel 1, kick drum, let's say. I want that to go to front of house console. I also want it to go to monitor console. I also want it to go up here, and I also want it to go into a kids rock room because they like to hear kick drum. Not that they would. As long as the network infrastructure is there, audio can be routed anywhere by 64 channels per device. probably the most important thing with mixing is EQ. If you had no other device to do anything with audio, but you had EQ, you could get a long way with it. What has to happen is you have, let's say, 60 waveforms, separate waveforms that are moving up and down separately at different rates, all that kind of stuff. Somehow they have to be combined together into two waveforms, a left and a right channel. So how that combination works and how well it combines, those waveforms combine, you know, that gives you the quality of your mix. And EQ helps you achieve a better balance of all the tracks being combined together into two waveforms. Now, if you kind of look at the physics of it, you know, when you look at a waveform, an audio waveform on the computer, it rises and it falls, right? That's literally the speaker movement. And anytime the sound wave goes up, the speaker's pushing out towards you. And anytime it falls below the zero line, it's sucking back in, right? So you're literally seeing the speaker movement on the waveform. So if you think about that and you say, okay, if it's playing back one waveform, great, it can move, it can represent that all day long. But now what happens if you take two waveforms and you combine them together? Well, let's say one waveform is going up while the other one's going down. So what does the speaker do in that situation? Well, it plays the difference. It plays the difference of those two waveforms, right? Now, imagine that happening times 60 tracks, what that waveform looks like and what's happening. Basically what happens is there's a lot of cancellation that happens. A lot of those waveforms don't get represented very well because the speaker can only move in one direction at one time. So, bringing you back to EQ and how that influences that is, you know, you're using your EQ to create room for all the tracks in your mix, right? So, you know, I'm a big fan of subtractive EQing, and here's why. Most of the time, any given track, whether it's kick, snare, bass, vocals, whatever, they're covering a large range of frequencies, right? They're covering from, you know, pretty low all the way up to pretty high. You know, vocal covers anywhere from 60 hertz and it can go all the way up to 15K, which is basically your whole audible spectrum, right? So all the other instruments are similar to that. They can really cover a wide range. So with EQ, you're kind of specifying or you're isolating those instruments to more specific ranges rather than covering the whole spectrum, so that the other stuff can fit in there and have its own space. Okay, so subtractive EQing is important because most of the time you have more frequency on any given track than you need to fit in the mix. So most of the time I'm finding myself cutting stuff out, problem areas out. So for instance, if you know, acoustic is too boomy or something, right? I don't need the low end in the acoustic because I have low end bass, I have low end and kick. So I'm going to cut out all my lows of my acoustic so that the kick and bass can use that space down there and not be clouded out by other tracks like the acoustic where I really don't need that content. Same with vocals, same with guitars, and all the way up and down the spectrum that happens. So you're really kind of you're picking and choosing what tracks where they sit in the frequency spectrum. It's kind of what you're doing, and you're using EQ to do that. Now, the flip side to that is, you know, a lot of people get into a solo game, right? Where they solo up the track and they get the track by itself, they get the bass sounding great by itself. Cool, but nobody's ever going to hear the bass soloed. And what happens is, if you solo it too much, then you're going like, oh, well, I need to make this bass sound good for itself, which is good, but also, yeah, but what happens when you put drums and guitars and and you know, all the other instruments in there? Well, now all of a sudden your bass is probably going to sound too. You're going to lose detail. There's going to be too much low end. The low end in your mix is going to be, you know, not tight and not clear. And that's really because there's just too much low end. Where you kind of have to think opposite. It's like, in order to get your bass to sit well in the mix, you're actually probably going to need to cut some low end out. because there's going to be low end content in the kick and a couple other instruments. So if you listen to a soloed, it's probably going to sound kind of thin, and probably thinner than you want it to sound. But when you add all the other stuff in there, it fills in that lack of low end that you hear in just the bass. So that's why you really have to take soloing with a grain of salt. How do things sound together and with each other? Focus more on that rather than how they sound individually. Now, with that being said, it is important to get them to sound decent individually, but again, never lose perspective on how they sound with everything else. Okay, so getting your mix to translate on different devices is just the most elusive thing ever. Okay, don't think that if you become a better mix engineer, you'll have it all figured out and those problems will go away, because they don't. If anything, they get worse, and you notice them more. So some of the things that I do to kind of help that is reference. In here I have nice studio monitors. These are beautiful sounding monitors, and it kind of makes things sound good. Falsely makes them sound good. So, my thought is like, okay, these are really detailed speakers. I can hear all the detail that I need to hear, so I can make really good EQ decisions. But because of that detail, they give you false hope of your mix. You listen to here and be like, wow, my mix is amazing. And then you take it to your car and you're like, ugh, what happened? Between here and the car, something changed drastically. Well, these speakers are supposed to sound good. They should sound good. But always reference your car so you know where it sits. Nobody's going to be able to hear your mix in these speakers except you and maybe a couple other people. But you need to be concerned about all the people online that are listening to your mix, out of earphones, out of their phone, maybe in their car. I can't tell you how many times where I'll be in here and I'll be like, yeah, I feel like it sounds really good. I'll immediately take it to my car, listen to my car, and a good 5 to 10 things immediately pop out. Like, oh, the kick is too big, the bass is too small, vocals could come out a little bit, hi-hat's a little hot. Things that I just didn't hear in here because I hear all the detail of all the instruments, right? So I immediately come back up here and make those adjustments. I trust my car and how my car sounds almost more so than I do the studio monitors. Don't fall into the trap of like, oh, I have to get the best studio monitors, the highest quality studio monitors so I can, really hear my mix. No, it's not about that. It's more about getting speakers that you're comfortable with. And over time of doing this back and forth between a phone, your car, earbuds, whatever, you start to get you start to kind of figure it out a little bit, and you start to know what needs to happen in here. You learn the speakers. You know what they need to sound like in here, so it translates better on other devices, right? And that's where you really start to get, you can really kind of perfect your mixes and get them to translate well. I think one of the most important things with broadcast mixing online is mastering, okay? Now, just to kind of go into what mastering is, right? Mastering is this kind of term that everybody has, it's like this term up on a pedestal that some people know what it is, some people kind of don't, but they know it's this magical process that happens with audio, right? Basically what mastering is and how it differs from mixing. So mixing is taking all the individual tracks, applying compression, EQ, effects, whatever, to all the tracks, right? That are being bounced down to stereo. So once they're down to stereo, you have your mix, your stereo mix. So what mastering is mastering takes that stereo mix and EQs the whole thing, compresses it, and mainly limits your whole mix, right? So in mastering, you don't have control over the kick drum. You don't have control of the vocals. Those have been set, those have been done and finished in mixing. So if you take that and listen to it in your car, you're gonna notice it's quite a bit quieter than, CD, I'm showing my age, but something you listen to on Spotify or something like that, because it hasn't been mastered. So what mastering does is it takes your stereo mix, and the main function of mastering is it limits it. So a limiter is just a compressor with a really hard threshold. So imagine this is the quietest you can get. This is clipping up here. What the mastering limiter does is it sets a threshold just below clipping, and I'm talking like 0.01 dB below clipping, small, just as close to clipping you can get. And it sets a threshold right there, and then it says, okay, now I'm going to take my overall mix and I'm going to turn it up. I'm going to gain up my mix, which is then some of those peaks are going to start hitting that limiter, but it's not going to clip it because that threshold's there catching all those transients. It's going to compress or limit them down. So the more you gain it up, the more that limiter is going to have to work to keep it from clipping. What that does, you are just compressing your mix, but it's changing the apparent or the average level of your mix. It makes it sound louder, right? Our ears respond to average level more so than they respond to peak level. Why this is important for broadcast is because with broadcast, you're taking your mix just like video. You're uploading it to whatever, Resi or YouTube or whatever it may be, and they're using data compression. That data compression, you're losing information. You're losing a lot of information to make that happen. So why mastering is important with that is if you give it nice healthy level of audio, it does a better job of maintaining the quality. Now, the other reason is iPhones and any device they're designed to play back mastered audio. They're designed to play back stuff off Spotify or whatever streaming service you're using, and everything there has been mastered. So their volume and where they've centered what they think is adequate volume is based on a mastered mix. So there's nothing more disappointing than turning your iPhone all the way up and it's just still not loud enough, right? You don't want that to be your product, right? You want your product to be like, yeah, you turn it up and it's as loud as if I'm playing something on Spotify. Got a master to do that. Here, it's all real time, right? So it's live. So I'm doing my mix. It's being mixed down to my stereo bus, essentially. And then I'm adding the mastering limiting on that. So it's all happening in real time. So the whole chain, all my mixing's happening, it's running through a limiter, getting mastered. So the final output is nice and hot and limited. So when you look at those audio meters, it looks like they're about to peg, and they're mostly solid, especially in the big sections. Now it moves with like dialogue and the speaking moments, but most of the music, it's mastered level. Red Rocks was, I think, really fortunate in that, we had pre-COVID, we had a pretty decent online presence already. If it's brand new to you, or if COVID kind of has forced your hand in it, it's a big step. That's a big step. One thing that I can highly recommend is either A, if you can, mix it separately than front of house. Okay, that's the first step you got. If you're taking a board mix from front of house, it works, but you'll notice it's probably not the product you want out of it, right? Because you're mixing for the room. You're not, it doesn't always translate well online. Then at that point, once you've separated that, then it's just a matter of practice. Just do it. Keep doing it. You'll get better. Your mixes will get better. They'll sound better. You'll kind of start to figure out this online broadcast and where the audio fits in with that.